After what seems like forever, Eidos Interactive's much-vaunted Deathtrap Dungeon is here at last. Based on the infamous Ian Livingstone fighting fantasy book of the same name, it's an action-oriented platform puzzle fighting type thing which looks a heck of a lot like Tomb Raider. In fact, at times it looks so much like Tomb Raider, you half expect Eidos to slap an injunction on themselves for breach of copyright. The similarities are overwhelming: the labyrinthine booby-trap-laden levels, the Prince of Persia-style puzzles, the simple fighting sequences, and of course a lead character with an enormous bosom. In fact, there's a choice of lead characters, one male, one female, but they've both got huge tits. The bloke, Chain Dog, a Conan-style barbarian, could easily swap places with Eva Herzegovina in one of those pile-up-inducing Wonder Bra ads.
Boys.
That'll help the traffic. Speaking of Chain Dog, now we see countless computer games here at PC Zone, and boy have we encountered some rubbish character names in our time. We've controlled gung-ho commandos with monikers like Corporal Kill and General Atrocitizer. We've run rings around unpronounceable apostrophe-strewn alien races hailing from unlikely-sounding worlds, such as the Fazis from the planet Spong, or the fucking Wankaz from the desert moon of Hujima Flip. And we tackled suspiciously familiar-sounding footballers, such as Adam Chira or Poul Kazgoin, in soccer games which hadn't secured the right license. But even we were appalled, yes, appalled, by the sheer rubbishness of the character names featured in Deathtrap Dungeon. For a start, there's Fang. That's the name of the town where the dungeon's been built. The cries of despair from the local tourist board are almost palpable. There's Baron Succumvit. He's supposed to be the man responsible for encouraging adventurers into the dungeon. Now, is it just us, or does his name sound like the title of some incredibly filthy West German porn film? And then there's Melkor. He's the evil red dragon you're supposed to be terrified of, so it's a pity his name conjures up images of refined English butlers. When I say Melkor, would you mind awfully buttering the underside of this roasted hog? There's a good chap. The female protagonist is called Red Lotus, and crass Conan aficionados will doubtless recall Red Sonja, an unforgivably poor star vehicle for Brigitte Nielsen, which appeared many moons ago. Perhaps this is some kind of sick homage to that towering opus. Yeah, well, whatever, it still sounds like either A, a flash sports car, or B, a bizarre ancient oriental euphemism for female genitalia. And finally, there's the aforementioned Chain Dog.
A name won in the savage war pits of the barbarian north.
So says the press bump. Presumably they're referring to Newcastle's big market. Anyway, it gets worse.
He was so brutal, so vicious and cunning, that the guards had to keep him chained up like a dog, to be unleashed only when it was time to fight. Hence his name. Chain Dog. The only word he ever responded to. The only word that meant anything to him. In a life of violence and sudden death, he held on to that name. Held on to the sense of identity it gave him. The great big prick.
Anyway, back to Tomb Raider 2, Deathtrap Dungeon. There are differences between the two games, of course, the most obvious being the use of varied camera angles. Whereas Tomb Raider used a faintly ominous stalker view throughout, DD employs both this and the Resident Evil multiple view model, although, unlike Capcom's horror 'em up, DD's camera pans and zooms to follow the action. It's a bit like watching the proceedings unfold on CCTV. While this constant switching from one angle to another keeps the game visually exciting and pacey, it's not always easy to tell where your next attacker is coming from. It also makes some of the leaps quite difficult to judge, which is very frustrating when the life of your character depends on it. DD actually has a higher action quotient than you might expect. At times it's almost like a beat-em-up with wave upon wave of crazed, slavering creatures hurling themselves at you. This is how Boyzone must feel, although presumably Ronan and company don't fight off their fans with warhammers and swords, which is what happens here. There's a worrying trend for in-game dismemberment at the moment. Witness last month's Die by the Sword, or the forthcoming Polygon test in Carmageddon 2. Deathtrap Dungeon is the latest culprit to hop on the limb-cleaving bandwagon. Arms, legs and heads fly through the air and bounce off the walls, spraying thick globules of blood as they go. In real life it would be hideous, unbelievable carnage which would haunt you to your grave. Here it's just funny. Although the level where you're encouraged to run around hacking scantily clad women to pieces in a murderous frenzy until you're standing ankle-deep in claret will do little to persuade the critics that video games are a valid 20th century art form which deserves their support. To be fair, it's not just women. Everything you can think of gets it in the neck at some point. There are 55 types of sword fodder, from bizarre blue imps to the fearsome centerpiece, Melkor, the dragon. And in case you were doubting the game's tongue-in-cheek credentials, the appearance of a few bizarre opponents, such as the guys who hop around inside a gigantic shoe, should clear things out fairly pronto. The actual sword fighting itself is disappointingly basic, with just a handful of different manoeuvres and the all-important blocking stance. The enemies tend to attack from all sides at once, so by the end of each level, your back is covered in scars. And finally, there's the puzzles, which are generally a case of finding a switch, then finding another switch, then putting up a couple of tricky jumps, and then putting another switch. And this goes on for one level after another. If you can be bothered to stick with it, it's actually not that bad. In fact, in many ways, Deathtrap Dungeon is quite a good game. It's just that it could have been a lot more. For example, if they'd included more RPG elements. On the plus side, the levels are huge and well designed. There are lots of different characters. There's always something going on, and it's usually quite entertaining. The graphics aren't bad, assuming you've got a 3D card. The controls are easy to get the hang of, and it'll run acceptably on a relatively low-spec Pentium 133. In fact, its only crime is that it simply doesn't excel in any of the things it sets out to do. It's the Crystal Maze meets Conan the Barbarian. 70%.